When I got that letter from the HOA demanding $2,500 for violating some so-called fence regulation, I actually laughed. I mean, it was ridiculous. But the second Jessica Thompson, the HOA president, stood in front of my 12-year-old daughter and said, and I quote, "The smell of cattle will bring down the property value in our neighborhood," something inside me snapped. Hi, I'm Luke Harrison. I'm the third generation of my family to live and work this land, and what Jessica didn't know that day was, she had just picked a fight with the wrong man. Let me take you back and show you exactly how this mess started, and how it ended. And I promise, by the end of this story, you'll be asking yourself, what would I have done if it were me? Leave your thoughts in the comments, and let me know where in the world you're watching from, because this is one of those stories you'll want to stick around for. It all started on a cool Tuesday morning in October. The kind of Texas morning where the sky is bright, the wind carries the scent of dry mesquite, and the land feels like it's been waiting for you all your life. I was out back, working on a cedar fence around the 5 acres closest to the house. My daughter Emma had been asking for goats for months, and I finally gave in. After losing my wife Sarah 2 years ago in a car accident, I've been trying to find small ways to bring joy back into our lives. Emma loved animals, and I thought that raising goats might help her smile again, help us both heal. As I dug post holes and measured the fence line, I couldn't help but remember Sarah. I could still see her in my mind, walking these hills with me on summer evenings. Her hand in mine. The way she'd laugh when the sky turned orange and the crickets started singing. This land wasn't just dirt and grass, it was memory. Family. Love. Every fence post I planted was a connection to something deeper, something worth preserving. I was tightening the last corner post when I heard the sharp click of high heels on gravel. That's not a sound you expect out here in ranch country. I turned to see a woman striding toward me with all the confidence of a CEO heading into a board meeting. She looked to be in her late 20s, blonde hair styled perfectly, not a strand out of place despite the heat. She wore a white t-shirt with a glittery pink heart on the front, a floral skirt that probably cost more than my monthly feed bill, and enough jewelry to catch the morning sun like a disco ball. In her hand was a clipboard, pulled from an oversized designer purse that didn't look like it had ever been near a cow, let alone a pasture. "Excuse me," she called out with the kind of tone that tells you she's used to being obeyed. "I'm Jessica Thompson, president of the Pine Hill Ranch Estates Homeowners Association. We need to talk about this fence immediately." I set my post-hole digger aside and wiped the sweat off my brow. "Ma'am," I said, keeping my voice polite like my father taught me, "I'm Luke Harrison. Nice to meet you." She flipped through the papers on her clipboard like she'd rehearsed it. "Mr. Harrison, all properties that affect the visual appeal of our community must comply with HOA standards. This rustic fence design doesn't match our established aesthetic guidelines." She said the word rustic like it was a contagious disease. Now, let me explain something. My family's been on this land for over 70 years. Long before this subdivision ever existed. Long before the HOA was even a concept. The only reason this land falls under HOA oversight is because of some technical zoning quirk when my father sold off a few parcels in the 90s. So hearing her talk about aesthetics, while standing on my land, wearing 10 pounds of jewelry, well, let's just say I had to bite my tongue. But it wasn't until she turned to my daughter that things really escalated. Emma had come outside to bring me a bottle of water. She stood there, innocent and quiet, watching us from the porch. Jessica glanced over and said, "You know, the smell of cattle and livestock could really drive down property values in this neighborhood." That's when I stopped smiling. She could find me, she could criticize my fence, she could even wave that clipboard around like it meant something. But the second she tried to shame my daughter for the animals we planned to raise together, for our way of life, that was a line she shouldn't have crossed. I looked Jessica in the eyes and said calmly, "This isn't just a property to me. This is my family's legacy. And ma'am, I suggest you turn around and walk back the way you came, before you embarrass yourself any further." That was just the beginning. What followed was a months-long battle of fines, town hall meetings, legal loopholes, and a surprise twist involving land ownership that even Jessica didn't see coming. This land has been in my family for 3 generations. My grandfather cleared these fields himself, built the original house with his own hands, and raised cattle long before the word subdivision ever appeared on a map around here. I looked Jessica Thompson in the eye and said plainly, "This ranch was here long before your subdivision was even a dream." For a split second, just a heartbeat, I saw something flicker behind that polished, picture-perfect facade of hers. Her lips tightened. Her confident expression faltered. And in that moment, I saw what lay underneath: fear. Not the kind you show in a storm, the quiet kind. The kind that comes when someone realizes they're not the biggest force in the room. But it passed quickly. She straightened her back, flicked her blonde hair over her shoulder, and forced that same fake smile. "Well, we'll see about that, Mr. Harrison," she said, her voice sharp as winter ice. "The HOA has certain rights and responsibilities. We're here to protect property values, for everyone." Then, with more force than necessary, she scribbled something on her clipboard, probably underlining her own name for dramatic effect. "I'll be in touch soon," she snapped, turning on her heel. As she started marching back down the driveway, that's when my daughter Emma came bounding around the corner of the house, backpack bouncing, boots untied, heading toward the bus stop. And suddenly, Jessica froze. She saw Emma. And something shifted. The judgment, the smugness, gone. Her face softened, her eyes almost longing. For a moment, Jessica looked like someone who was seeing something they desperately wanted but couldn't have. Her hand moved without thinking to rest on her flat stomach. A small, involuntary motion. A truth trying to break through the cracks. But then, the smell of hay and manure must have caught up with her, or maybe just the reality of Emma running freely across her perfect neighborhood, because her eyes iced over again. The door slammed shut. She stepped forward and bent slightly toward Emma with this fake sugary voice that made my stomach turn. "Honey," she said, her words slow and deliberate, "doesn't this smell bother you? The odor from these animals. It's going to make the whole neighborhood a lot less pleasant to live in." Emma stopped in her tracks, her face caught in that in-between space kids go when they aren't sure if they've done something wrong. She looked at me, then at Jessica, then back at me. Confused. Hurt. And right then, something inside me, that father instinct, lit up like wildfire. Jessica hadn't just crossed a line. She'd bulldozed over it. I stepped forward, placing myself directly between her and my daughter. My voice dropped into that quiet, heavy tone that people who know me recognize as a final warning. "Mrs. Thompson," I said, "this conversation is over." Jessica flinched. It was small, the kind of reaction a person can't fake. Her knuckles whitened around the edge of her clipboard, like she was holding on for dear life. "This isn't finished, Mr. Harrison. Not by a long shot." She spun around and stormed off, her heels crunching over the gravel again. Emma and I just stood there, watching the dust settle. After Emma hopped on the school bus and waved goodbye from the window, I stood alone beside the new fence. The cedar wood still smelled fresh. My gloves hung over the post where I'd left them. Jessica's words kept replaying in my mind, but more than her words, it was the look she gave Emma. That calculated cruelty hidden beneath a mask of concern. She hadn't just tried to shame me, she'd tried to shame my daughter. For our animals. For our land. For our life. That wasn't going to fly. I watched her white BMW disappear over the hill, back toward the uniform beige rooftops of Pine Hill Ranch Estates. And I knew in my bones that she'd just started a fight she wasn't ready for. 3 days later, the next strike came. An official letter showed up, stamped and sealed with the HOA's emblem like it came from the White House. Inside was a formal violation notice, complete with photographs, citations, and a final warning header in big red letters. Apparently, the fence was not just aesthetic non-compliant. It was an unauthorized modification subject to daily fines until it was either removed or brought into alignment with the Pine Hill Architectural Harmony Plan. I didn't know whether to laugh or light the letter on fire. But what I did know crystal clear was that Jessica Thompson had made this personal. And if she wanted a war over fences, goats, and family legacies, she was going to get one. 3 days after Jessica Thompson's little visit, I came home to find a notice taped to my front door. It wasn't some flimsy printout, either. Thick, expensive paper. The HOA logo at the top practically screamed authority. I knew it was trouble before I even opened it. The $2,500 fine was right there in bold, supposedly for violating HOA fence regulations. But that wasn't the part that made me stop in my tracks. No, it was the line at the bottom, written in slightly larger print like they wanted to make sure I didn't miss it. Continued violations may result in property seizure proceedings. I read it once. Then again. Then I started laughing, not because it was funny, but because it was so absurd it almost felt like a joke. My blood was boiling, sure. But above all, I was stunned at the audacity. Either Jessica Thompson had no clue what she was talking about, or she was counting on the idea that I didn't. That I'd read those big scary legal words and fold like a lawn chair. But she didn't know me. And more importantly, she didn't know this land. I could picture her writing the letter in that polished white kitchen of hers, surrounded by granite countertops and overpriced decorations from those boutique stores in town. Probably sipping her second almond milk latte of the morning, bouncing between legal blogs and homeowners' forums on her laptop, cherry-picking the scariest legal terms she could find. Property seizure. Non-compliant structure. Escalated enforcement. That wasn't a letter, it was a performance. Carefully choreographed to make me feel small. To push me into submission. And honestly, that's what made me laugh. Every word on that paper had been chosen with precision. The typeface, the tone, the structure, all meant to intimidate. I imagined her hand trembling just a little as she signed it, not because she was scared, but because of the thrill. The rush of thinking she'd finally cornered me. That she'd won. That I'd read that threat and back down like all the others probably had. But Jessica Thompson had made one critical mistake. She came after a man who knows exactly where he stands. That evening, after dinner, I went out to my dad's old office above the barn. The place hadn't changed in years. The floorboards still creaked in the same spots. The desk was still scratched in the corner where I'd carved my initials as a kid. The air smelled like dust, tobacco, and oil, and to me it smelled like home. I opened the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet, pulled out the heavy steel lockbox, and started digging. Inside was everything Dad had ever thought important. Birth certificates, marriage licenses, cattle permits, tax receipts, and newspaper clippings going back to the 1960s. And buried underneath it all, just where I remembered it, was the original deed to our property. Yellowed with age, but still crisp, still legible. Signed and sealed in 1962. A full half-century before Pine Hill Ranch Estates even existed. I held it in my hands and felt something deep inside settle. The deed was clear. My family's land, all 40 acres, had never been and could never be subject to HOA jurisdiction. Not legally. Not morally. Not even remotely. That ranch stood on its own, long before Jessica Thompson ever set foot in Texas with her high heels and her homeowner guidelines. I spent the next 2 hours making copies. Highlighting lines. Drafting a response letter that made my position unmistakably clear. No emotion, no insults, just cold hard facts written with the clarity of a man who'd had enough. Then I sealed everything in a thick envelope and set it on the counter by the door. I wasn't going to mail it. I was going to deliver it myself. At exactly 8 o'clock the next morning, I walked up the steps of that oversized colonial mansion she called a house, the one that looked like it belonged in a magazine about suburban perfection, not rural Texas. The lawn was flawless. Not a blade of grass out of place. The bushes looked like they were trimmed with a ruler and a protractor. Everything screamed control. Jessica opened the door already dressed for the day, yoga pants, another glittery designer t-shirt, and hair that had clearly been done hours ago. Either she'd been up since dawn or hadn't slept a wink. I handed her the envelope. "Mrs. Thompson," I said calmly, "I thought you might want to review these before the situation goes any further. You'll find that my ranch predates Pine Hill by several decades. That it's not subject to HOA authority. And that any further threats, including property seizure, may be considered harassment under Texas state law." She took the envelope but didn't even glance inside. Just handed it back like it was blank paper. That's when I realized she wasn't interested in truth. She was interested in control. "Mr. Harrison," she said, voice tightening like a cord being pulled, "I don't think you understand how things work around here." And that's when it hit me. This wasn't just about rules. It wasn't about fences. This was about a woman who'd gotten used to people backing down. And now she was staring at a man who wouldn't. Jessica Thompson didn't even blink as she said it. "My husband Brian has connections throughout this county. The HOA has certain rights that extend beyond simple property lines." Her voice had that polished smugness again, the kind that people wear like armor when they think name-dropping will scare you. But beneath it, I caught something else. A tremble. A crack in the foundation. Desperation. In that moment, I knew exactly what kind of war she'd been waging against other homeowners. This wasn't her first fight. Just the first time she picked the wrong opponent. And within a week, her harassment campaign began in earnest. It started subtly. I began getting visits from county inspectors. First, environmental health. Then building safety. Then code enforcement. One after another, like a parade of uninvited guests, each holding a clipboard and trying to appear official while they poked around my land. At first, I was polite. Then I started asking questions. They all looked uncomfortable. Not one found a single violation. Not even close. And by the time the third inspector left, shaking his head in frustration, I realized something important. They knew what was going on. They knew they were being used as pawns in a personal feud, a grudge match masquerading as regulation. I could see it in their eyes. They didn't like it. But they still had to show up. Because someone with influence, someone like Brian Thompson, had made the calls. So I did the only smart thing a man can do when he's being backed into a corner. I started documenting everything. Every visit. Every conversation. Every piece of paper slipped under my door. I built a binder thicker than a legal textbook. I logged the dates, times, names, even the license plates of the county vehicles that came by. I wasn't just preparing to defend myself anymore. I was building a case. But no amount of preparation could have gotten me ready for what happened next. I came home from work one afternoon and found Emma sitting in the kitchen, her arms wrapped around herself, red-faced and shaking. Her backpack was still on, untouched, like she hadn't even made it to her room. "Dad," she choked out, "Mrs. Thompson called the school today." I froze. She told them we might be living in unsanitary conditions. Because of the animals. And they pulled me out of class to ask me all these questions. About our house. About you. About whether I felt safe here. I stood there, heart pounding, hands clenched at my sides. She didn't deserve that. My daughter, 12 years old, still grieving her mother, still trying to find light in our quiet, rugged life, shouldn't have to explain to strangers why the smell of goats doesn't mean neglect. She shouldn't have to defend the only home she's ever known. Jessica Thompson had crossed every line. She wasn't just harassing me anymore. She was weaponizing my child. Turning adult power plays into school investigations. Using bureaucracy to humiliate a little girl. That night, after Emma went to bed, I called my neighbor Helen McCarthy. She'd lived next door for over 20 years. Knew the land, knew my family, and more importantly, knew the HOA from the inside out. What she told me confirmed every fear I hadn't wanted to believe. "Luke," she whispered, "Jessica's been going door to door. She's got a petition. She's telling people your cattle are going to ruin their property values. That it's going to stink. That their homes will be worth less." I closed my eyes, jaw tight. "She's gotten a few signatures," Helen continued. "Mostly from the new folks. The ones who don't know your family. But between you and me? Half the HOA board thinks she's gone too far. They're just afraid to say it out loud." Of course they were. People like Jessica rule through intimidation. And fear works, until someone stands up to it. The next morning, just when I thought she couldn't go any lower, I found something else waiting for me. A thick envelope from the county planning office. Inside, a notice of petition to rezone my property. A hearing was scheduled for the following month. If approved, the land would be converted from agricultural to residential only. I sat in my truck for a long time, the letter in my lap, my coffee untouched. The sun had just risen over the pasture. The dew was still fresh on the grass. In the distance, the goats were grazing. Emma's favorite had climbed up on a rock like a king. That rezoning wouldn't just kill my ability to farm. It would strip away the agricultural tax exemption that made it possible to maintain 40 acres. It would crush us financially. And that's when the final puzzle piece clicked into place. This wasn't just about fences. Or property values. This wasn't even about goats anymore. Jessica, and more importantly, her husband Brian, wanted my land. Maybe they saw the pasture and envisioned tract homes with price tags. Maybe Brian's development company had been waiting for a way in, and Jessica's little HOA crusade was just the first wave of the invasion. Smear the reputation. Fabricate complaints. Trigger zoning changes. Make it financially impossible to stay, and then swoop in to buy the land at a distressed price. That morning, something shifted in me. The anger that had been simmering for weeks finally hardened into something clearer. Sharper. Determination. Jessica Thompson thought she could intimidate me. Scare me. Break me down. She had no idea what she'd awakened. I wasn't going to be another quiet casualty in her game. I wasn't backing down. This land is my family's legacy. And if she wanted a fight, she was about to get one. Jessica Thompson was about to learn what happens when you back a Harrison into a corner and try to tear down 3 generations of legacy with nothing more than legal tricks and bureaucratic manipulation. She thought she could overwhelm me with threats and paperwork. But I wasn't just some stubborn rancher. I was a man with deep roots, a long memory, and now, a fire in my chest that wasn't going to burn out quietly. That Monday morning, I walked into the county planning office with a steel resolve and a briefcase packed tighter than a courtroom filing cabinet. Every document inside had been carefully chosen: zoning maps, tax records, historical land surveys, property deeds. But what I carried more than anything was weeks of building determination. I'd taken the day off from my landscape design business to dedicate myself to research, and what I'd uncovered made my blood boil. Jessica and Brian weren't the first to try this strategy. It was a well-rehearsed scheme in the development world. Buy up land surrounding a target property, push for rezoning to choke out agricultural viability, then swoop in with lowball offers when the landowner's financial situation became unsustainable. It was predatory, and it had worked before. But not this time. I asked to speak with Pete Rodriguez, the county commissioner who oversaw zoning issues. Pete had known my family since I was a teenager. We weren't close, but there was mutual respect. Still, when I sat down across from him in that small, windowless office, I could tell he didn't want to be in this conversation. He sighed and leaned back. "Luke, I've got to be honest with you. This rezoning petition, it's got heavyweight backing. Brian Thompson's development company submitted a comprehensive plan. Parks, schools, new roads, the whole 9 yards. They're calling it a revitalization initiative, and claiming it's in the public interest." He slid a thick folder across his desk, and I flipped it open. Sure enough, the plan was polished to perfection. Artist renderings of modern homes, dog parks, walking trails, community gardens. Everything looked picture perfect, at first glance. But buried deep in the fine print was the real game. Brian's company had already secured purchase options on 3 other parcels surrounding my ranch. The options were contingent on the rezoning going through. If they got my land designated residential only, I'd lose my agricultural tax exemption, and it would become financially impossible to maintain 40 acres. They were setting the trap. All they needed now was for me to fall into it. I closed the folder slowly and looked Pete dead in the eye. "Let me ask you something," I said, voice steady but firm. "How many other family farms has Thompson Development acquired using this exact strategy?" Pete didn't answer right away. His eyes shifted for a second before settling back on mine. "Luke, I can't comment on ongoing investigations. But let's just say, you're not the first to raise concerns." That was all the confirmation I needed. For the next 2 weeks, I worked like a man possessed. Every spare minute went into preparation for the public hearing. I dug through archives, scanned newspaper clippings from as far back as the 1940s, and collected affidavits from local historians confirming continuous agricultural use of my land for nearly a century. I became fluent in county code, zoning law, and land use policy, quoting chapter and verse like a seasoned attorney. But I didn't stop there. I reached out to other farmers and ranchers across the county, people who'd been burned by the same tactics or had stood their ground and won. What I found was a network of people just like me, proud, hardworking folks who'd poured their lives into land that was now being targeted by developers with dollar signs in their eyes. And they came through. Some offered advice, others sent letters of support. A few even promised to show up at the hearing. Turns out, when you threaten one farmer's land, you're threatening every farmer's way of life. And that doesn't go unnoticed out here. The night of the hearing arrived. The county courthouse was packed, standing room only. Locals filled the benches, many of them wearing boots caked in honest dirt, hats in their hands, arms crossed tight. The Thompsons, of course, showed up late, strolling in like they already owned the place. Jessica wore a fitted white blazer, clipboard in hand like always, and Brian trailed behind in a tailored suit, shaking hands with county officials like it was a campaign stop. But this wasn't going to be their stage. When my name was called, I stepped up to the podium and looked around the room. My voice didn't shake. I laid out the facts. The history of my land. The impact of the proposed rezoning. The financial sabotage it would cause. The precedent it would set. I showed documents, read letters, quoted legal precedent, and reminded the board, and the room, that my family had been here long before there were paved roads or HOA meetings. Then I paused, took a breath, and delivered the part that hit hardest. This isn't just about my land, I said. It's about what kind of county we want to live in. One where outside developers use legal loopholes to destroy local farms, or one where we protect the families who've been stewards of this land for generations. I stepped down to applause. Jessica didn't clap. She whispered something to Brian, who stared at the floor. But it didn't matter. The people in that room knew the truth now. And for the first time since this all started, I felt like maybe, just maybe, we were going to win. Jessica arrived at the courthouse like she was stepping into a corporate boardroom, not a public zoning hearing. She didn't come alone, either. Her entourage was a lineup of suits, polished, stiff, all business. The kind of people who saw land as square footage and families as line items. She'd flown in a law firm from Dallas, and their lead attorney was a woman in a tailored navy blue suit who looked like she billed by the minute and didn't waste a second. Brian Thompson slouched in the front row, scrolling through his phone like this was just another day at the office. Like our land, our lives, were just numbers in a spreadsheet. When Jessica took the podium, her voice was cool and controlled. She spoke like a seasoned politician, practiced, persuasive, polished to perfection. She talked about property values. She talked about community standards and responsible development. She used phrases like the greater good and shared responsibility, as if she was trying to sell compassion while holding a knife behind her back. Ladies and gentlemen, she said, gesturing toward a glossy chart pinned on an easel, we're not trying to harm Mr. Harrison or his family. We're simply asking that all property owners in our neighborhood be held to the same standards of responsible land use. The chart showed a dip in local property values, colored red to look like danger. The smell, the noise, the potential health hazards of livestock operations, she continued, are incompatible with modern suburban development. There were nods from a few newer residents in the back, people who'd moved in from the city, drawn to the fresh air but now offended by the reality of rural life. But then it was my turn. I stood slowly, took a long look around the room. These were faces I'd known since I was a boy. Neighbors who'd waved to my dad when he drove the tractor into town. Friends who'd helped us rebuild the north fence after the flood of '97. Teachers who remembered when I was Emma's age. My grandfather bought this land in 1942, I began, with money he saved working double shifts at the oil refinery. I pulled out the original deed, yellowed with age but still clear. I held it up so everyone could see. My father expanded the ranch, raised his family here. For over 50 years we've paid taxes, supported local businesses, showed up at school board meetings and church fundraisers. This land isn't just property. It's legacy. I spread the historical documents across the hearing table. Maps. Photos. Crop records. I laid them out like sacred scrolls. This ranch was here before the subdivision. Before the HOA. Before the Thompsons ever set foot in this county. The room was quiet. No shuffling. No murmuring. Just stillness. What we're really talking about tonight isn't zoning, I said. It's not about property values. It's about a development company trying to force out long-time residents so they can fatten their bottom line. They're not here to build community. They're here to build profits. I turned to Brian, who finally glanced up from his phone. Our eyes locked. Mr. Thompson's company has used this exact same strategy in 3 other locations. They rezone the land, pressure the owners, undercut their taxes. And when the families can't hold on any longer, they buy them out at half the value. Gasps rippled through the room. People started whispering. Commissioner Sarah Walsh leaned forward in her seat. That's when Jessica lost her composure. Instead of letting her high-powered attorney handle the rebuttal, she leapt to her feet. Her face was flushed with anger, not the careful red of blush, but the uncontrolled burn of fury. That's completely false, she barked. We're trying to create a beautiful, cohesive community that benefits everyone. Her voice cracked slightly at the end, too high, too loud. Several people in the audience shifted in their seats. One woman frowned and crossed her arms. Mr. Harrison is being selfish and stubborn, Jessica snapped, refusing to adapt to changing times. The lead attorney gave her a sharp look, the kind you give a client who's about to sink your case. The room, once on edge, was now clearly against her. The longer she spoke, the more unhinged she seemed. She'd overplayed her hand. After a pause, Commissioner Walsh leaned forward and cleared her throat. Given the complexity of this issue, she said carefully, and the conflicting information presented tonight, the board will be postponing our decision for 30 days. We need time for additional review. It wasn't the victory I had hoped for, not yet. But it wasn't a loss either. It was time. And time was something Jessica Thompson had just given me without meaning to. Because now the community had seen both sides. They'd seen her army of lawyers and her poster boards. They'd heard the cold rehearsed speech. And then they saw me, one man standing with 3 generations behind him, protecting not just a fence or some goats, but something much deeper. Legacy. And now I had 30 days to make sure the truth wasn't just heard, it was undeniable. It wasn't the victory I'd hoped for, but it wasn't a defeat either. The postponement bought me something far more valuable than a ruling, it bought me time. And time was all I needed. As people filed out of the courthouse that evening, I noticed several Pine Hill Ranch Estates residents hesitating, hovering near the aisle like they wanted to say something but weren't sure how. Finally, an older man, tall, silver-haired, wearing a faded golf shirt, stepped forward. I recognized him from down the road. "Mr. Harrison," he said, avoiding my eyes at first, I signed that petition. Jessica told us you were planning to expand into commercial farming. She made it sound like you were building a factory barn. I had no idea this was about forcing you to sell your family land." 3 other residents nodded behind him, their expressions matching his, sheepish, guilty, but genuine. I could see it in their faces. They'd been misled. Manipulated. And now that the mask had slipped from Jessica's carefully curated narrative, people were starting to see the truth. People don't like being lied to, especially not by someone who claims to be protecting their best interests. As I packed up my documents, still absorbing the evening's events, I caught a glimpse of Jessica out in the courthouse parking lot. She stood alone beside her pristine white SUV, wiping at her eyes with the back of her manicured hand. Brian Thompson was nowhere to be seen. His BMW had peeled out of the lot minutes earlier, apparently leaving his wife to clean up the mess herself. And for just a brief second, I almost felt sorry for her. But then I remembered the sound of Emma crying in the kitchen. I remembered the look on her face when she told me Jessica had called the school. Some lines, once crossed, can't be uncrossed. Especially when a grown woman targets a child in a war that never should have existed. That night, long after Emma had gone to bed, I found myself back in my father's old office. The air smelled of dust and old paper, and the glow of the desk lamp cast long shadows across stacks of documents. I sat there until nearly 3 o'clock in the morning, surrounded by borrowed law books from the county library, zoning ordinances, and every piece of property paperwork I'd managed to collect since the day this mess began. For years, I'd worked in landscape design. I understood land. I understood the rules that governed how it could be used. But this wasn't a design job. This was war, and I needed to find something that would end it. I searched through boxes of old survey maps and records, flipping through brittle paper and yellowed folders my grandfather had filed away decades ago. Most of it was dated, outdated, or irrelevant. But then, buried at the bottom of a box marked easements and mineral rights, I found it. A faded piece of paper, dated 1943. Nearly crumbling in my hands. It was an easement agreement, a livestock access easement, to be exact, granting cattle the legal right to pass through what is now the Pine Hill Ranch Estates development. Back then, it had just been open land and dusty trails. But no one had ever challenged or revoked that easement. Not in 80 years. Which meant it was still valid under Texas property law. I stared at it, blinking. Then I laughed. Out loud. Probably loud enough to wake Emma if she wasn't such a sound sleeper. Jessica Thompson and her high-powered law firm had tried to drown me in legal threats. But in doing so, they'd stepped onto ground that my family had already mapped, literally, generations before. They wanted to play hardball with a man whose family had been here since before their subdivision was a blueprint in some land developer's office. Well, now it was time to hit back. And sometimes, the old ways are the best ways. The next morning, I called Jake Martinez, an agricultural lawyer based out of Burnett County. Jake was sharp, respected, and known for fighting tooth and nail for ranchers like me. He'd helped 2 other families in the area push back against HOA overreach and development pressure, and his reputation for finding creative legal angles was exactly what I needed. I scanned the easement document and emailed it over with a short note, "You're going to want to see this." He called me back within the hour, laughing almost as hard as I had the night before. "Luke," he said, "this is a gold mine. Not only does it undermine the HOA's zoning argument, but if that easement is still active, and from what I'm seeing, it could give you grounds to file a legal injunction against them for obstruction." That was music to my ears. The hunter had just become the hunted. I met with Jake later that day, and we spent the afternoon reviewing the legal strategy. His confidence was infectious. He said we had more than enough to not only block the rezoning, but to challenge the HOA's entire campaign against me as harassment, possibly even press charges under state law if they continued. Jessica Thompson had tried to use the law as a weapon, but she'd never expected it would end up pointed back at her. When I showed Jake the old easement document, his grin stretched nearly as wide as mine. "Luke," he said, tapping the paper like it was a winning lottery ticket, "this is exactly what we need. If we can demonstrate continuous agricultural use and establish the historical precedent, we can not only protect your ranch, we might be able to expand the agricultural zoning to include the entire easement corridor." It was the legal equivalent of finding buried treasure. And for once, I felt like the land itself was fighting back. While Jake dove headfirst into the legal strategy, researching easement law, digging through county archives, drafting cease and desist notices, I started calling in reinforcements. The agricultural community in Texas is a tightly woven network. When one rancher is under threat, word travels fast. And when that threat comes from a suburban HOA trying to wipe out a working ranch, well, let's just say folks tend to take that personally. Within a week, I had commitments from 5 neighboring ranchers. They were loaning me cattle, real heavy-breathing, pasture-grazing, grass-munching cattle, for what Jake and I dubbed the Educational Grazing Project. The plan was simple: demonstrate that the land along the easement had always been used for livestock passage. That even though suburban lawns had popped up around it, the historical use hadn't changed. And legally? That mattered. Emma was thrilled. More cows meant more animals to care for, more activity around the ranch, and maybe, just maybe, a chance to turn fear into something like pride. But she was still a kid, and kids see the world in heartbeats, not legal briefs. "Dad," she asked one evening as we fed her goats together, "what if Mrs. Thompson gets really mad when the cows show up?" I knelt down beside her, brushing a lock of hair out of her face as the goats nuzzled her hands for treats. I said quietly, "sometimes adults make bad choices when they're scared or angry. But that doesn't mean we stop doing what's right." She looked at me for a moment, thinking. Then her face brightened with a grin. "Can I help take care of the cattle when they get here?" "You bet you can," I said. "In fact, you're the assistant ranch manager now. Official promotion." She giggled and saluted. "Yes, sir." The cattle arrived on a crisp Tuesday morning in early November. 30 head of mixed-breed cows and steers rolled in on 2 livestock trailers and stepped down into our pasture like they'd lived there all their lives. They spread out in a gentle herd along the stretch of land that bordered Pine Hill Ranch estates. I made sure they stayed well within our property lines. Every boundary was respected. Every fence was secure. But they were visible. Their warm breath fogged the air. Their hooves softened the ground. And their presence sent a clear message: the land was alive, not for sale. I set up a folding chair near the fence line with a clipboard and a thermos of coffee. Emma helped me put up a small sign: Livestock Passage Educational Demonstration, easement in effect since 1943. Subtle but clear. I didn't have to wait long. 2 hours later, Jessica's white BMW came tearing down the main road of the subdivision, faster than any HOA president ought to be driving. 10 minutes after that, she was stomping across my gravel driveway, her heels clicking like gunshots on stone. She looked like someone in the middle of a corporate meltdown, sunglasses on top of her head, designer tote swinging wildly, and fury etched into every stiff movement. "What is the meaning of this?" she barked, gesturing dramatically toward the cattle. "You can't just bring a herd of cows here without permits or environmental impact studies." I stood slowly, calm as ever, hands resting on the top of the fence post. "Mrs. Thompson," I said, you're standing on private land. This livestock is here under legal easement rights established in 1943. I have full documentation if you'd like to see it, and my attorney is happy to walk you through the county filings if you're still unclear." She opened her mouth to argue, but then paused, just for a second, as the word easement hit her. I could see the gears turning behind her eyes. She didn't know about it. And now, she realized she should have. But the subdivision, this whole area, none of this was even here back then, she snapped, flustered now. "Exactly," I replied. "Which means the easement predates all of it. And legally, that means your HOA, your board, and even your husband's development company can't override it without going through a full revocation process, which hasn't happened. Not in 80 years. Jessica stared at the cows, who were peacefully munching grass without a care in the world. "This isn't over," she hissed, turning on her heel. "I think it might be," I said quietly, just loud enough for her to hear. "You just didn't realize it yet." She didn't respond. Just stormed back to her car, slammed the door, and peeled away in a cloud of dust. I took a slow sip from my coffee, watching the cows swish their tails in the autumn sun. Emma came out a moment later, holding 2 cups of hot cocoa. "Did she see the sign?" she asked, grinning. "Oh, she saw it," I said, smiling back. And for the first time in months, the ranch felt peaceful again, not just because we'd found a way to fight back, but because we'd done it with history on our side. And history, as it turns out, is harder to bulldoze than most developers think. Her crisp white t-shirt was already showing sweat stains, despite the cool November air. Strands of Jessica Thompson's perfectly styled hair were starting to fall from her updo, sticking to the sides of her face as frustration overtook her carefully controlled composure. "Mrs. Thompson," I said calmly, still seated in my folding chair, clipboard on my lap, coffee in hand, "these cattle are grazing on my property as part of a legitimate agricultural operation. All permits and health inspections are current and up to date." I didn't bother to stand. I didn't need to. My posture, my tone, and the facts were doing all the talking. What I didn't mention, at least not yet, was that the cattle had also been strategically positioned to graze along the historical easement line. Should a legal challenge come, they were already fulfilling the land's long-standing use. "If you have concerns about lawful agricultural activity," I added, "I'd suggest you contact the County Agricultural Extension Office." Jessica's face turned a shade of red that clashed wildly with her pink heart t-shirt. Her lips pressed into a tight line before she spat. "This is harassment. You're doing this just to spite me and the Homeowners Association." Then, in dramatic fashion, she whipped out her phone and began dialing furiously. "I'm calling the sheriff. Right now." I nodded with a pleasant smile and turned my attention back to the cattle, watching them contentedly chew their cud. Emma had given one of the smaller calves a name that morning, Daisy, and I smiled as I watched her nudge up to the water trough. 20 minutes later, a familiar white and blue county patrol car rolled up along the fence line. Sheriff Tom Bradley stepped out, adjusting his belt and glancing around with the weary look of a man who dealt with one too many neighborhood feuds. "Morning, Luke." "Jessica," he said, nodding to each of us. "What seems to be the problem here?" Jessica wasted no time. She launched into a rapid-fire monologue about livestock invasions, property values, zoning violations, health concerns, HOA bylaws, the works. She gestured wildly at the cattle, her voice rising with each sentence until even the cows started to look confused. Meanwhile, I said nothing. Just calmly reached into my folder and handed Tom the easement documents, grazing permits, and inspection reports that Jake Martinez had prepared with military-grade precision. Tom took his time, reading each page carefully. Every so often, he glanced at the cows, then at Jessica, who had started pacing like a prosecutor mid-trial. Finally, he folded the documents neatly, handed them back to me, and cleared his throat. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, "Mr. Harrison is conducting legal agricultural activity on his own land. Everything here is in order. Unless these animals enter the subdivision or cause actual damage to property, there's nothing unlawful happening." Jessica opened her mouth to argue, then stopped. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. She looked like a fish gasping for air, standing there amid dust and indignation. Tom gave me a small nod and tipped his hat before turning back to his cruiser. "Y'all have a good day now," he added. Jessica stormed off without another word, heels crunching on gravel as she marched back toward her car. Once she was gone, I leaned back in my chair, let out a breath, and took another sip of my now lukewarm coffee. The cattle settled in, clearly unbothered by the morning's drama. Daisy let out a small, lazy moo. Phase 1 of the counterattack? Complete. But I wasn't stopping there. I still had 30 days until the county zoning hearing, and I intended to make use of every last one. By noon that same day, the reaction from Pine Hill Ranch Estates was already buzzing. I counted at least 15 cars slowing as they passed our fence line. Some drivers snapped pictures from behind their steering wheels. Others actually pulled off to the shoulder and got out, gawking at the herd like they were tourists on a ranch safari. A few looked annoyed, maybe worried about the smell or noise or their property values. But most seemed curious, intrigued. The neighborhood kids, in particular, were fascinated. A group of 3 rode up on bicycles, peering through the fence with wide eyes. One of them asked if they could pet the cows. "Not today," I told them gently. "But maybe we can arrange something later. These girls are just settling in." They nodded eagerly and rode off, shouting excitedly about real cows and cow poop. I chuckled to myself. And that was the thing Jessica didn't understand. She tried to frame me as some stubborn old farmer stuck in the past, someone incompatible with her vision of a neat, picture-perfect suburb. But in reality, people were hungry for something real. For authenticity. For connection. My ranch represented something that no HOA rulebook or luxury development brochure could offer: roots, history, purpose. And that's something no amount of zoning manipulation could erase. The educational grazing project continued for the next few weeks with surprising success. Local agricultural students came by to observe the cattle. I gave an impromptu tour to a small homeschooling group from the subdivision. Even a few skeptical residents stopped by with questions, and left with a better understanding of what this land truly meant. Meanwhile, Jake was working overtime, preparing for the final showdown. The easement had teeth, and the law was on our side. But the bigger win was happening quietly, through every interaction, every conversation, and every hoofprint pressed into the soil. Jessica Thompson had wanted to erase my family's legacy. Instead, she'd helped put a spotlight on it. The cows were practically in their backyards, and Emma was in heaven. She'd taken it upon herself to become the official tour guide for any neighborhood kids brave enough to approach the fence. By day 3, she'd written name tags for half the herd and was giving enthusiastic lectures on the difference between a steer and a cow. Her energy was contagious. Children came in waves, drawn by curiosity and the irresistible pull of something real, not from a screen or textbook, but breathing, mooing, living reality. But while Emma thrived, Jessica Thompson was unraveling. From my kitchen window, I watched her storm from house to house, clipboard in hand, high heels stabbing into the manicured grass of Pine Hill Ranch Estates like she was skewering the earth itself. She was clearly trying to rally support for some kind of emergency HOA action, gesturing wildly at each doorstep, her movements sharper and more frantic with every stop. Her white BMW made no fewer than 6 trips up and down the main road that afternoon. And each time she passed my property, she slowed down, glaring at the cattle like they had personally insulted her decor. The herd, in contrast, paid her no mind, grazing peacefully in the fading autumn light like they had all the time in the world. That evening, the first official response arrived. Every mailbox in Pine Hill Ranch Estates received a hand-delivered notice, printed on HOA letterhead in all caps: urgent, livestock invasion threatens property values. Beneath the screaming headline was a list of supposed health and safety concerns, including disease risks, potential noise violations, and even increased emotional stress caused by barnyard proximity. If it wasn't so desperate, it would have been funny. A special HOA meeting was scheduled for the following evening at 7 p.m. Mandatory for all concerned residents. I decided I'd go, not as a resident, but as a neighbor. A curious, law-abiding neighbor who wanted to understand these so-called community concerns firsthand. The meeting was held in Jessica's oversized garage, which had been hastily converted into a kind of budget war room. Folding chairs were arranged in uneven rows, and a projection screen had been rigged up with what looked like duct tape and optimism. About 25 people showed up, roughly half the neighborhood. Jessica stood at the front, wearing a navy blazer over one of her usual designer t-shirts. She was clearly aiming for executive under pressure, but the lines of stress on her face betrayed the cracks in her facade. Thank you all for coming on such short notice, she began, her voice clipped and tight. As you know, we are facing an unprecedented threat to our community's peace, safety, and yes, property values. She clicked a remote, and the projector flickered to life. The words agricultural encroachment, a clear and present danger, appeared in bold across the screen. What followed was a 20-minute fear-mongering masterclass. Jessica delivered a dramatic PowerPoint complete with alarmist headlines, cherry-picked statistics, and grainy stock images of muddy cattle yards that looked like they'd been pulled from disaster documentaries. She spoke of disease transmission, as if a few clean, vaccinated cows on the edge of town could start a plague. She listed property value declines in agricultural zones, conveniently leaving out that our land wasn't zoned residential to begin with. She cited studies about insects, odor, noise pollution, and something she called emotional livestock fatigue. You had to admire the dedication. It was like watching someone try to turn a backyard barbecue into a federal crime scene. When she finally opened the floor to questions, there was a beat of uncomfortable silence. Then, an elderly man in the front row slowly raised his hand. "Jessica," he said gently, "I drove by the Harrison place this morning. Those cattle looked perfectly healthy, and well-behaved, too. My grandkids were excited to see them. They said it was like going on a little farm field trip." A few people in the crowd chuckled and nodded. Jessica's mouth twitched. "With respect, Mr. Dawson, this isn't a petting zoo. It's a coordinated attempt to undermine our neighborhood's integrity." Another hand went up. A woman near the back, young mid-30s, holding a toddler on her hip, spoke next. "I brought my son to see the cows this afternoon. He's never seen one up close before. I honestly didn't mind. It's kind of refreshing." Jessica tried to regain control, her voice rising an octave. "It's not about individual enjoyment. It's about standards. About long-term impact. This livestock stunt is clearly retaliation." That was when I stood up. All eyes turned toward me, and I made my way slowly to the front of the garage. I wasn't loud. I didn't need to be. I let my voice carry with the kind of calm authority that comes from generations of lived experience. "I appreciate being allowed to sit in tonight," I began, nodding toward Jessica, who was glaring daggers. "I just want to clarify a few things. The cattle on my property are part of a fully legal, fully permitted agricultural demonstration, backed by historical documentation, current law, and the Texas Department of Agriculture. I'm not here to pick a fight. I'm here because this land matters, not just to me, but to the story of this whole county." I paused and looked around the room. "I respect every one of you. You moved here to raise your families in a peaceful place. That's what I'm trying to do too, on land my grandfather worked with his own hands." There was silence. Then a few quiet nods. Jessica's face was frozen in a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. I walked back to my seat, the room still thick with tension, but the atmosphere had shifted. The fear Jessica had tried to spread was being met with something stronger: truth. And this was just the beginning. "Are we sure this is really a problem?" The question came from Mr. Dawson, the elderly man in the front row who just praised the cattle as a joy for his grandkids. His tone was calm, but the room rippled with its impact. Several other residents nodded in agreement, their body language shifting subtly, arms uncrossing, shoulders relaxing. Jessica's composure cracked, just slightly. "Mr. Peterson," she replied, voice climbing an octave, "I understand your grandchildren might find the animals entertaining, but we have to consider the long-term implications." She clicked to the next slide on her presentation, which showed a grainy photo of a sprawling industrial feedlot. Today it's 30 cows. What happens when it's 100? What happens when we have commercial feedlots and slaughterhouses moving into our neighborhood? The slippery slope argument. Classic. But it wasn't landing. From the back of the room, a younger woman raised her hand. "Has anyone actually talked to Mr. Harrison about his plans? I mean, has he said anything about expanding or causing problems for the neighborhood?" A pause. Jessica opened her mouth, but nothing came out at first. Her cheeks flushed. "That's not the point, Karen," she said sharply. "The point is that we can't allow agricultural activity to dictate the character of our residential community." That's when Helen McCarthy stood up. Helen was in her late 60s, a retired schoolteacher, and one of the original residents of Pine Hill Ranch Estates. She'd lived next to our family ranch for over 2 decades, and when Helen spoke, people listened. "Jessica," she said evenly, "I've been Luke Harrison's neighbor since before a single house in this development existed. His family has done nothing but treat this land, and this community, with respect. This presentation makes it sound like he's running some kind of industrial farming operation, when in reality, it's a small herd of cattle grazing land that's been used for livestock for over 60 years. The room erupted in whispers and quiet murmurs. People shifted in their seats. I could see it happening, the tide turning. Jessica had tried to whip up fear, but instead, she had stirred doubt about herself. Sensing the shift, she tried one last desperate move. "I'd like to call for a formal vote," she said quickly. "A resolution demanding that Mr. Harrison remove all livestock from the property within 72 hours. But the room wasn't hers anymore. The vote failed. 12 opposed, 8 in favor, and 5 abstentions. The moment the meeting ended, people filed out of the garage with mixed looks, some apologetic, others thoughtful. Several approached me quietly. Handshakes. Nods of solidarity. Soft-spoken apologies for assuming the worst. One woman even slipped me a bag of cookies and said, "For Emma." I walked back to my truck with a slow, steady breath. Jessica Thompson had overplayed her hand. She could have opened a respectful dialogue, asked questions, voiced concerns. But instead, she'd launched a full-blown smear campaign against a grieving father and his daughter. Now the neighborhood had seen it, and the spell was breaking. But I knew better than to get comfortable. People like Jessica don't just give up when they lose. They double down. And sure enough, the next morning brought confirmation. I found a formal notice from the county planning office taped to my front gate, petition to amend zoning ordinance, public review scheduled. Apparently, my petition, to reinforce and extend the agricultural zoning protections around the ranch, had been approved for public hearing. The date, 2 weeks from today. Jessica had wanted a fight? Well, she was about to get one. Only now, the battlefield was the county courthouse. I knew this hearing would be the culmination of everything, not just this latest cattle fiasco, but decades of tension between old rural ways and new suburban ambitions. Between families like mine, with roots in the land, and people like the Thompsons, who saw acreage as real estate, not heritage. And I intended to come prepared. That same afternoon, I called Jake Martinez. "Jake," I said, "it's on. The zoning hearing is happening in 2 weeks. Can you be there?" Jake didn't hesitate. "Wouldn't miss it. We'll prep like it's a courtroom brawl." Over the next 10 days, I worked harder than I had in years. I collected everything: photos of my grandfather working the land in the 1940s, tax records proving continuous agricultural use, aerial maps from before the subdivision was built, testimonials from neighbors. I documented every goat, every cow, every fence post. Emma helped too, cataloging photos, organizing printouts, even making posters. "We should call it Save the Ranch," she said one night, eyes shining. Like a real campaign. She wasn't wrong. Because this wasn't just about our land anymore. It was about a way of life. A legacy. And I had no intention of letting Jessica Thompson rewrite history just because she didn't like the smell of cows. But one stubborn rancher thinks his personal legacy is more important than the future of our community. Jessica's voice echoed through the courthouse chamber, rising into a shrill pitch that made several people in the crowd shift uncomfortably. Her hands clutched the edge of the podium, like she was trying to physically hold her argument together. Gone was the carefully controlled HOA president with polished talking points and legal backup. What stood before everyone now was a desperate woman who had lost control of her narrative. She glanced around, expecting applause, or at least nods of agreement, but was met instead with silence. Worse than that, indifference. The very crowd she had counted on to support her had started to slip through her fingers. A few chairs creaked. Someone coughed. Jessica's lawyer cleared her throat and gently stepped forward, signaling that the presentation was complete. "Thank you, commissioners," she said diplomatically. "We rest our case." The chairwoman of the zoning board, Commissioner Walsh, turned to me. "Mr. Harrison, you may now respond." I stood, adjusted my jacket, and took a slow breath. My boots echoed across the floor as I walked to the podium, carrying a thick folder of documents in one hand and a rolled-up survey map under my arm. "Commissioners, neighbors, friends," I began, my voice steady but strong. My name is Luke Harrison. I'm a third-generation rancher on land that's been in my family since 1942. What I just heard from Mrs. Thompson wasn't a zoning argument. It was an attempt to erase history, to rewrite the past so that it fits a vision she imposed the day she moved in. I unrolled the map and pinned it to the board beside me. This is a historical land use survey from 1956, showing the very same pasture you see today, used for cattle. I have tax records, aerial photos, and official land deeds to prove that agricultural use on this property has been uninterrupted for over 80 years. I held up the faded easement document. And here's the kicker: a legal livestock easement from 1943. That means cattle have the right to pass through land now occupied by Pine Hill Ranch Estates. That document has never been revoked, never been challenged, and by Texas law, it's still enforceable. That got a few murmurs from the audience. One of the commissioners leaned in to get a better look. But let's talk about what this is really about, I continued, locking eyes with Jessica, whose face was now flushed and unreadable. This isn't about zoning. This is about control. It's about one person trying to dictate what the rest of us can and can't do with our land. Jessica Thompson wants to turn our county into a gated fantasy where anything real, anything that doesn't match her version of perfection, gets pushed out. I let the silence hang for a second. My cattle aren't weapons. They're part of a legacy. My daughter and I care for them every morning before the school bus comes. My grandfather taught me how to run fence lines on that land. My late wife's ashes are scattered in the east pasture. This isn't just where I live, it's who I am. I turned to face the commissioners again. This case is about whether our community values legacy over leverage, whether history still matters, and whether a group of developers can walk into a town and rewrite its rules because they have more money and louder lawyers. With that, I stepped back. Thank you. The room was quiet for a long moment. Then applause broke out, hesitant at first, but then it grew. Some stood. Others clapped quietly, respectfully. Even the zoning board didn't try to stop it. Jessica didn't clap. Her arms were folded tightly across her chest, and her lawyer looked down at the floor. Commissioner Walsh raised her hand, calling the room to order again. "Thank you, Mr. Harrison," she said, her tone professional, but not cold. "Given the significance of this case and the historical documentation presented, we will recess for deliberation." They exited through a side door, and the room buzzed with murmured conversations. I sat beside Emma, who squeezed my hand tightly. "You did amazing, Dad," she whispered. 20 minutes later, the commissioners returned. Commissioner Walsh stood, cleared her throat, and read from a prepared statement. After reviewing all documentation and hearing arguments from both sides, the board finds that Mr. Harrison's property qualifies for protection under current agricultural zoning law, and that the historical easement is valid and enforceable. We therefore rule in favor of Mr. Harrison. Petition to rezone is denied. The room erupted again, this time in full applause. I didn't move. I just sat there, hand in Emma's, breathing in the moment. After all the stress, the threats, the manipulation, we'd won. Not just legally. Morally. Truthfully. As people began to filter out of the room, I saw Jessica standing in the back alone. Her lawyer was already gone, her phone in hand, but she wasn't making any calls. Just staring at the ground like the weight of everything had finally hit her. I thought I might feel triumphant, vindicated. But what I actually felt was done. I'd protected what mattered. My land. My daughter. My family's legacy. And now it was time to go home, back to the hills my grandfather walked, the soil my father worked, and the future I'd build, one sunrise at a time. Too late. The courtroom was silent. Not because of what she'd said, but because of how she'd said it. Jessica Thompson, the polished, poised president of the Pine Hill Ranch Estates HOA, had just stripped away every veneer of professionalism she had so carefully constructed. Her voice cracked. Her tears were real, but not redemptive. Her carefully rehearsed image had collapsed into raw emotional chaos. And everyone saw it. Her lawyer gently guided her back to her seat, whispering in her ear while avoiding eye contact with the commissioners. Across the room, residents of the subdivision, the same people she'd once swayed with printed flyers and PowerPoint charts, now sat in stunned silence. Some looked away. A few were whispering among themselves. Others simply stared, unsure what they had just witnessed. But I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't triumphant, either. Standing at that podium, with generations of my family's work behind me and my daughter watching from the second row, I felt tired. Tired of fighting, tired of justifying, tired of watching common sense and decency be twisted into something political and vindictive. So I finished with the one thing Jessica never seemed to understand: grace. I don't blame Mrs. Thompson for being passionate, I said quietly, stepping back up to the microphone. We all want what's best for our families. We all want our communities to be safe and clean and beautiful. I glanced toward her, not with anger, but with something closer to pity. But building a good neighborhood doesn't come from controlling every detail. It comes from respect. From honoring what was here before and making room for what comes after. I turned back to the board. This land is more than just soil and fence posts. It's memory. It's legacy. It's responsibility. And I will keep honoring that legacy for as long as I'm breathing. Then I stepped away. No mic drop. No big theatrics. Just the truth, left hanging in the air like a flag that didn't need waving. Commissioner Walsh called for a brief recess so the board could deliberate. The chatter in the room was quieter now. The drama was over. What remained was the decision. Emma slipped her small hand into mine as we sat on the bench waiting. "I'm proud of you, Dad," she whispered. I smiled, my heart full and aching at the same time. "I'm proud of us, Em." 15 minutes later, the commissioners returned. Walsh cleared her throat. "We've reviewed all evidence and testimony presented tonight," she said, eyes scanning the room. "And we find that Mr. Harrison's property maintains valid agricultural zoning and that his historical easement rights remain legally intact." Jessica's lawyer dropped her pen. The board rules in favor of Mr. Harrison. The petition to rezone is denied. Applause didn't erupt this time, not out of disrespect, but because people understood this was deeper than a win or a loss. It was something more permanent. Something rooted. I stood up, nodded respectfully to the board, and walked out of the courthouse with Emma beside me. We didn't say much on the ride home. We didn't have to. The cows were still grazing peacefully when we pulled into the drive. The sun had dipped low, painting the sky in soft oranges and pinks, the same sunset I remembered watching with Sarah years ago, the same hill she loved. And as I stood there, leaning against the fence post I'd installed with my own hands, I realized that Jessica had never really been the enemy. Fear was. Fear of change. Fear of difference. Fear of losing control. And the best way to fight fear isn't with fists or lawyers. It's with truth. With patience. With roots. So no, I didn't just win a hearing. I kept my promise. To my father. To Sarah. To Emma. And to every other family fighting to hold on to what matters most. Full custody of their 2 dogs, the only dependents they shared. Jessica, once the self-appointed queen of Pine Hill Ranch Estates, found herself isolated, her carefully curated life crumbling faster than any fence post I'd ever had to replace in a storm. But this story was never really about Jessica. Not in the end. This was about standing your ground, literally and figuratively. It was about the power of legacy, the quiet strength of truth, and the importance of community. Pine Hill Ranch Estates learned a valuable lesson, one I hope stays with them. When people try to rewrite the rules to suit their own image of perfection, they risk erasing the roots that made the place worth living in to begin with. The following spring, something amazing happened. The Pine Hill HOA, now led by Helen McCarthy, invited me to speak at their annual neighborhood barbecue. Not as a concession, but as a gesture of unity. I agreed, not for me, but for Emma. She deserved to grow up in a place where neighbors shook hands over fences instead of filing lawsuits across them. That day, as I stood in front of a picnic table covered in potluck dishes, children running barefoot on the grass, and yes, cows grazing peacefully just beyond the fence line, I realized something. Sometimes, the best way to win a fight is to simply outlast the storm. To endure. To remember who you are. Because no matter how many PowerPoint slides or legal tricks someone throws your way, they'll never outweigh generations of honest work and the quiet, unwavering heartbeat of land that remembers you, because you never left it. So if you've ever been backed into a corner by people with more money, more influence, more power, just remember this: they may have a bigger voice. But you have deeper roots. And in the end, it's the roots that hold when the winds come. Ponytail was messy, her clothes dirt-streaked, and the manicured image she once clung to so tightly was long gone. She didn't see me, or maybe she did and chose to look away. Either way, I didn't wave. I didn't gloat. I just stood there for a moment, watching the woman who had once tried to bulldoze my family's legacy, now stacking soil for someone else's garden. Emma tugged on my sleeve. "Dad, is that?" "Yeah," I said quietly. "That's her." "Do you think she's still mad at us?" Emma asked, squinting toward the road. I paused, then shook my head. "I think she's mad at herself." We finished the fence work in silence after that, the kind of silence that says more than words ever could. Because the truth is, I didn't hate Jessica. Not really. She lost herself in a war she didn't understand, waged with weapons that couldn't hold up to time, truth, or community. And in the end, she lost. Not because I beat her, but because she couldn't see the value in what was already here. Because she thought control was stronger than connection. That polished perfection could outlast the grit of real history. But Texas remembers its roots. It remembers the people who raised fences not to divide, but to protect. It remembers families who bled into the soil and handed down more than just land. They handed down stories, strength, and spirit. 6 months after that summer, the Heritage Ranch tours expanded into weekend workshops, school field trips, and even a seasonal festival. Pine Hill Ranch Estates, once hostile to the sound of hooves, now boasted brochures advertising the charm of rural life with modern amenities. Funny how things work out. And Emma? She's already talking about going to Texas A&M to study agricultural science. Says she wants to run the ranch properly one day, not just as a business, but as a legacy. Sometimes I think about Sarah, how she'd smile at the sight of our daughter leading school groups through the pasture, goats trotting behind like they belonged in a storybook. And I know in my bones, we did the right thing. So if you're ever driving down a county road in Texas and see a faded red barn, some cows in the field, and a weathered sign that says Heritage Ranch Tours, EST 1942, come on by. We'll show you around. We'll tell you stories that no spreadsheet or subdivision will ever understand. And maybe you'll leave with more than pictures and souvenirs. Maybe you'll leave with a little piece of what it means to belong to something deeper than land or title, a legacy. Designer clothes replaced by work boots and a sun hat. That was the new Jessica Thompson. I saw her one afternoon, across the highway at the garden center, stacking mulch bags for a customer. She looked up and caught sight of me, and for a moment, our eyes met across the distance. Her hand twitched upward, maybe a wave, maybe just a small acknowledgement of everything that had passed between us. I nodded back. Sometimes people have to lose everything before they can find out who they really are. That evening, Emma and I were sitting on the front porch watching the sun dip low behind the hills, painting our land in warm gold, the same land my grandfather had worked, the same porch my father had built. The cattle were settled in the pasture, their soft lowing blending with the sounds of crickets and the occasional hum of traffic from the highway. It was the kind of peaceful moment that reminded you why the fight had been worth it. "Dad?" Emma asked, resting her head on my shoulder. "Do you think Mrs. Thompson learned anything from what happened?" I let the question hang in the air. It was one I'd asked myself more than once. "I hope so, sweetheart," I said finally. "Everyone deserves a chance to make things right. But they've got to want to change first." Emma nodded thoughtfully, then gave me a cheeky smile. "Do you think she'll ever come to one of our ranch tours?" I couldn't help but laugh. Now that would be something to see. 6 months after the zoning hearing, the one that turned the tide not only for us but for small landowners all across the county, our ranch was officially designated a historical landmark. The county installed a metal plaque near the front gate commemorating 3 generations of Harrison family contribution to the land and the community. Emma was thrilled. She posed with it like it was a trophy and then immediately asked if she could be the one to tell guests about it on the tours. The historical status didn't just bring us pride. It brought legal protection, and unexpectedly, it even raised property values in the surrounding area. Pine Hill Ranch Estates, once desperate to scrub out any hint of rural character, was now being marketed as nestled beside a working heritage cattle ranch, offering authentic Texas charm. Oh, the irony. With Helen McCarthy now serving as the new HOA president, cooperation replaced confrontation. We launched a monthly Heritage Ranch tour open to the public, and they were a hit. Families came from miles around. Kids got to ride horses, feed goats, and listened to Emma explain how her great-granddad dug the original well with nothing but a shovel and grit. Our agri-tourism model took off. Local schools began scheduling field trips. A small coffee stand opened by the barn. And yes, the easement path that used to cause so much trouble? It's now a horseback trail called Thompson Crossing. Helen named it. I didn't argue. Jessica, meanwhile, had faded from the neighborhood. After Brian filed for divorce and her legal troubles piled up, she sold the big white house and moved across town to a modest apartment. Word was she got a job at the garden center just to make ends meet. Helen said she kept to herself, didn't talk much. And while a part of me did feel sympathy for her, a larger part remembered the day she stood in front of my 12-year-old daughter and tried to shame us out of our way of life. But here's the twist: her crusade didn't destroy us, it made us stronger. It forced me to dig deep into my family's legacy, to learn the laws, to stand tall in rooms full of powerful people and defend what mattered. Her attempt to erase us ended up immortalizing us. That's the thing people like Jessica never understand. Land isn't just dirt. A ranch isn't just a property. It's a story, one written in sweat, sacrifice, and stubborn hope. I watched Emma that evening as she bounced up from the porch and ran off to check on her goats. Her hair caught the last light of the sunset, and for a second, I saw Sarah in her, strong, kind, and fearless. 3 generations of Harrisons had watched this sunset. And now, thanks to all we'd fought for, there would be a 4th. Jessica Thompson tried to take that away from us. Instead, she helped preserve it forever.